One of the most famous executions to have taken place throughout history saw a young French girl who had led the French army against the English during the 100 Years' War being burned alive. Joan of Arc is remembered as a saint of France today, and she was deemed a martyr after her burning. Many of those English soldiers who witnessed her death that day claimed that they had burned a saint and not a witch, and they immediately regretted their actions. But what was the story of Joan of Arc, and what led to her horrific execution? Join us today as we look at the execution of Joan of Arc, and remember to support our channel. Please make sure to subscribe. Conflict between England and France was ongoing for centuries by the time the 100 Years' War came around. It began in 1337, after a dispute as to who was the rightful claimant and heir to the French throne. Initially, the English had a significant amount of success against the French, and they won most of the battles. They almost got their wish, establishing a dual monarchy over England and France. When Joan of Arc was born, the French king was Charles VI, and he wasn't the most stable king, as he often went absent after suffering from bouts of ill health and insanity. In 1420, the Queen of France, following the spectacular English victory at Agincourt, granted King Henry V what he wanted. She was willing to leave the French crown to the King of England and his heirs rather than her own son. Henry V died in 1422, and following this, Henry's son Henry VI became the King of England and France, despite being only a very young child himself. Because of this, his uncle John of Lancaster acted as the regent. But Joan herself was a daughter of Jacques d'Arc and Isabelle Ramay, and they lived in Domremy. Joan's parents, it's believed, owned around 50 acres of land, and her father was a farmer and tax collector in the local area. They lived in part of France that was faithful to the French king throughout the conflict, but there were many raids in the area. During one of these, Joan witnessed her village being burned to the ground by rebels. She was not highly educated, and it's claimed that she could not read and write, but she was a very different child to many others in the village. At the age of 13, Joan had her first vision, which would make her very famous across the country. She said that in her father's garden, she had a vision of St. Michael, St. Catherine, and also St. Margaret. During this episode, it was claimed that the saints had told her she was the one to force the English out of France for good, and to take the Dauphin of France to his consecration once they were defeated. She said the saints were beautiful, and when she was 16, she asked a family member to take her to visit the commander of a local garrison. She asked for an armed escort to take her to the French royal court, and the commander refused, to begin with, but Joan persisted and came back a few months later. She then got the support of the commander's soldiers, and she met with the commander, and this meeting coincided with a slight change in France's fortunes in the 100 Years' War. There had been some improvement near to Orleans, and Joan had predicted this. Because of this, she was considered to have been sent from God, and the commander was persuaded to take her to the French royal court. Joan went with the commander and her escort through dangerous lands, and she was disguised as a male soldier in armour. It was a dangerous thing to do to escort the young girl across a war zone, but Joan first met with the Dauphin Charles at the royal court in 1429, aged 17. She made an impression on Charles, and Joan then asked the Dauphin to accompany the army, and she was given permission to wear armour. She was seen as captivating, but the French had been suffering so much during the 100 Years' War, and because of this the Crown were willing to take risks and chances to reverse their fortunes. Many could have viewed Joan as a witch or a heretic, but through her visions and her involvement in the 100 Years' War, she began to turn the tide of the conflict. She claimed the saints had sent her to improve France's chances, and this is what she did. Dauphin Charles did order an investigation of Joan to see what her personality and morals were, to see if she was trustworthy. It was deemed she was a good Christian, and was humble, honest, and her intentions were good. With this, Charles used her in a military detachment, and she was sent to see if she could lift the siege of Orleans. The English had been besieging the town since October 1428, and the city was of importance to both sides, and the English were heading to victory. Joan was given armour and a horse, and her first action was to join a convoy to bring supplies into the town. She wanted to face the English from the north, but the commander decided to go south. Joan did not like this, and she ordered an attack on the nearest English Bastille. It was here where one of Joan's miracles, it's believed, occurred, when the wind changed direction and the French ships were brought upriver, and the convoy was allowed to sail to Orleans quickly without arousing any suspicion. Joan of Arc then entered the town on the 29th of April at 8 p.m, and there were wild celebrations. She was paraded as a hero in the streets, and she gave out food and pay for the soldiers. She also sent a detachment of messengers to the English to tell them to leave. When she arrived, things changed, and the French then began to capture different fortifications and positions. She did get injured, and she was hit by an arrow between the neck and the shoulder, but recovered very quickly, and the French believed that God healed her, and she went back fighting. When the final assault was launched, the French managed to lift the siege, and the English retreated, and Joan had done it. When she lifted the siege, it gave her an immense amount of support and celebrity across France, but the English deemed that she must have been a witch, or must have been possessed by the devil. This was because they could not deal with the fact a young peasant girl had defeated their mighty army, and some believed that God was on the side of the French. More success came for Joan, and the English then conceded more lands, and Charles was then consecrated as a king, as Joan had seen in her visions. Her arrival and leading of the army was a big turning point, and Joan was even there when he was consecrated, standing with her banner near to the altar. Further military campaigns continued when the French attacked Paris, and Joan was injured again by a crossbow bolt hitting her leg. The assault on Paris did fail, and a truce was agreed, but Joan then began to become involved in religious matters. She criticised the Hussites, who broke from the church, and told them if they did not recant, then Joan and her army would kill them. The truce with England did fail, and Joan went across to defend against the English and the Burgundians. She was involved in a group that tried to attack the Burgundian camp, and she was ambushed and was then captured. Joan stayed near the rear of her army, but the Burgundians surrounded her and pulled her off her horse, and she then surrendered. She was then imprisoned in a castle, and did try to escape a number of times, including one where she jumped from her tower, which was around 70 feet tall. After this she was moved, and the English saw her worth as a prisoner, and negotiated a transfer from the Burgundians to the English. It cost them heavily, but Joan was then transferred to Rouen. The French did try to rescue her, but the attempts failed, and Joan was then put on trial. She was accused of heresy, and the trial was supposed to bring Joan embarrassment and shame. It began in February 1431, and Joan was not allowed a legal advisor, but it was guaranteed that she was to die. The English could not let Joan leave a free woman, and she was accused of a huge number of charges, including wearing men's clothes and witchcraft. Nuns who visited her claimed she was pure, and at trial she defended herself in a mature and well-spoken way, and she got the upper hand over her prosecutors. She claimed the English had abused her in prison, and that she dressed as a man to defend her modesty. Her trial was then held in private, and she was interrogated a great deal, and was held in a military prison, and was threatened with torture. On the 29th of May 1431, Joan of Arc was found guilty of heresy. On the morning of the 30th of May, her death sentence was carried out. She had been sentenced to death to be burned at the stake as a witch would be. Joan, when she heard of this, became very distressed, and said she would rather be beheaded. Her guards laughed at her and made fun of her, but one took pity on her and gave the 19-year-old woman a wooden cross before she was tied to the stake. She was led out to the marketplace in Rouen, and a scaffold was there to greet her, with a large stake on top of it. Joan kissed the wooden cross she had been given, and was then surrounded by soldiers and a crowd of over 10,000. She was secured to the stake. An eyewitness account stated of the events that, "I was present at the last sermon of the day she was burned." There were 3 galleries of scaffolds, one where the judges sat, one where many bishops sat, and one where the wood was prepared for the burning of Joan. At the end of the sermon, the sentence was pronounced, which delivered Joan to secular justice. After this sentence was pronounced, Joan began to make many pious exclamations, and amongst other things, she said that there was nothing she had done, either good or ill, had been suggested by the king. Thereupon I left, not wishing to see the burning of Joan. I saw many of the bystanders weeping. The fires were lit, and the flames rose heavily. Joan was tied to the pillar, and she asked the clergy to hold a crucifix in front of her, as she stared at the symbol, and the flames rose higher. She prayed as she was burning, and there was some horror in the crowd. Someone tried to throw extra kindling on the fire, but was stopped from doing so. Within minutes Joan of Arc was dead, and the English went further, burning her body twice more to make sure there was nothing left of her, to stop any relics being collected, and her ashes were thrown in a river. The execution of Joan of Arc was an incredibly brutal one, but for many the young 90-year-old girl was deemed to have been sent by God to help the French war effort. Even the English worried about burning her, and they claimed they'd burned a saint and that they would be damned for doing it. Today Joan is remembered as a warrior girl who led the French against the English in the 100 Years' War, and she is considered an important figure in medieval history. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.